And please allow me to welcome Tom FISHBURNE on stage. Welcome, Tom. I'm going to hand it over to you from here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be with you today. This is my first ever time in Delhi. It's my second ever time in India. It's a great treat to be here and to be a part of this conference. I'm going to talk today about Gen Z. This is actually the first time I've been asked to speak about Gen Z. And when I mentioned it to my daughters, they got very excited about the fact that I was coming to India. And their first reaction was, "Who are you to talk about Gen Z?" They thought it was hilarious that I was being asked to talk about Gen Z. Because I am clearly not speaking to you as a member of Gen Z or as a Gen Z whisperer. Instead, I am talking to you as a cartoonist. And I'm going to try my best today to talk about some of the mindset that I think we need to have as marketers and as brand owners to think about Gen Z, the best way to approach Gen Z. What do we know about Generation Z so that we can get them to buy stuff? So far, all we know is that they hate brands that try to get them to buy stuff. It's a conundrum. It's a conundrum to approach this generation, and I think sometimes the advice that we hear can be really confusing as marketers. How do we make sense of this? How do we think about Gen Z, which is often framed as if it's some other type of species that we're trying to reach? Some of the advice can be kind of confusing. The PR agency Edelman even hired what they refer to as a ZEO to help people think about how to make sense of this generation. The main headline story in The Guardian a couple of months ago, the main piece of advice was, don't make some weird old-ass campaign. Okay, not really sure how I make sense of that. What do I do with that practically as somebody working in marketing? And so often the approach on how to think about Gen Z can feel a little bit like a prescriptive checklist, or try this one weird trick, and somehow this generation will pay attention to what you have to say. How could our brand appeal to Gen Z? Use slang like lit and riz. Just get on TikTok. Do collabs with influencers. Pay them to say we're authentic. Post about every single social issue. And memes. Gen Z loves memes. Maybe we shouldn't treat Gen Z like a monolith. Silence. Anyway, what else would be lit? The other approach that we see is often to think we only need to show up wherever they are, and the younger generation will pay attention to our brands. Excuse me, are you Gen Z? Our brand wants to engage with you. Where should we try to reach you? TikTok? Snapchat? Instagram? Discord? Roblox? Twitch? Hey, where'd you go? So the standard approach, I think, can oftentimes leave brands a little bit flat. And oftentimes we'll see examples of a through line directly to the famous Kylie Jenner incident with Pepsi, where brands misstep on trying to reach the younger generation. There's also a through line, I like to think, going back much, much further than the time we're in right now. There's a direct through line from Oldsmobile, this is not your father's Oldsmobile in 1988, to not your mother's Tiffany in 2021. In fact, it's an evergreen challenge for brands to try to appeal to the younger generation without alienating the current generation. And that's a bit of the tone that I want to take about today, is demystifying some of what we often hear about when it comes to Gen Z, and also thinking about them a little bit with a little bit more nuance. Less as this monolithic group that thinks, feels, and believes everything the same, and more as a bit of a harbinger for the future, and a way that all brands should evolve their mindset to continually reinvent themselves to connect with younger generations on an ongoing basis. So that's a bit of the approach that I want to take. With Tiffany, huge backlash to that campaign. It's a very difficult feat to compel mothers to write about how they want to throw away their wedding ring because they were insulted by the campaign. And I feel like the approach that often is taken with brands appealing to Gen Z is if it has to be completely eschewing of the old and approaching the new. And it's a mystifying, complex time for all of us as brand owners to make sense of it. Tiffany has backtracked a bit on that campaign, but they're continuing to evolve and grow in different areas. They're doing collaborations with streetwear brands. They're even trying to do partnerships with Pokemon. But I think it reflects Tiffany's conundrum, reflects the conundrum of a lot of brands that have been around for a long time. How do you appeal to this current generation and do it in a way that's authentic to you, that takes advantage of all the tools and technology that is at our disposal, but does it in such a way that it actually engages with the younger generation and sets you up and prepares you well for the future? We need to age down our financial services brand to appeal to a younger generation. Why are you looking at me like I'm cray-cray? This is kind of what we want to avoid. And that's a bit what I want to talk about today. And I'm speaking to you, as I mentioned, as a cartoonist. I'm also a marketer. I've been drawing a weekly cartoon now called Marketoonist for a little over 20 years. And my perspective really comes from that. I started initially as a hobby, drawing about my day job. And I found that there was something that would happen where I would sit in my office at General Mills working for a brand, thinking about how we could evolve and do the things that we do better. I would draw a cartoon making fun of what I was going through as a marketer, and I would hear from people of what others were going through in their marketing jobs. And a friend of mine described what would happen when I would hit send on my email during the workday, that people's heads would pop up over the cubicles like prairie dogs, and it gave us a way to talk about what we were all going through together. And so if there's one big message that I want to share today, it's that we need our sense of humor more than ever to make sense of the mystifying times that we're in. And this applies in how we attract Gen Z, as well as all the other myriad challenges that you're addressing and that are reflected in this overall conference. Whether it's how you apply new technology, how do you engage with new audiences, how you think about it, remember your sense of humor. And that brings me to you. We did a cartoon caption contest with everybody here ahead of time, and you may have seen some signs at the event. I want to share some of the funniest captions that you submitted to this visual as a way to get things started, and to remind us how everybody in this room sees the world a little bit differently, and when we tap into our sense of humor, it can help us make sense of it. So here we have a situation with a boxing glove coming out of a screen. This ad will definitely be a hit. Hey, ChatGPT, can you make my brand more appealing to my consumer? Looks like that ad left an impression on your face. Every digital marketing campaign has a reaction. Better watch out next time. Was the screen trying to turn you off and on? How many times have I told you that LinkedIn is not Tinder? When did MarTech make poke so literal? Would you like to see my hook? And then the final one, did you again fail to prove that you are not a robot? Can I get some applause for everyone who sent these in? This is great. I love this type of exercise because it shows we all see something a little bit differently. And I think when we feel comfortable laughing with our colleagues, even laughing with complete strangers about something that we're all experiencing it helps us call out when the emperor has no clothes. It helps us point out some of the funny things that we all go through in marketing, and helps us ultimately do a better job at what we do. I had the opportunity a few years ago to work with these two professors at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. They're pioneering the first ever MBA level course on the power of humor in business. And they invited me to be their cartoonist in residence. And they shared a lot of research I found interesting. One of those is something they described as the humor cliff. They found this huge repository of data that measures the number of times an average person laughs in a typical day over the course of their life. And they found that it drops off a cliff right after we graduate from university and take our first jobs. And then it starts to creep up again a few years after retirement. And their main message to their students, and one of my main messages for you today, is don't fall off the humor cliff. It can be an incredible asset when we try to make sense of the world today and what we're trying to do in marketing. So with that in mind, I want to walk through 5 observations I have about Gen Z. and how we can think as marketers about how to make the most impact with this generation and how to approach it. And ultimately, try not to fall off of this humor cliff. Okay, the first idea is that Gen Z is not a monolith, but they can help us see the future. I'm here to recruit a digital native to replace my VP of marketing. There's a group in London that studied Gen Z against every other generation. And what they released a few years ago was quite surprising. They looked at group cohesion. Within a group, how much do they actually think, feel, and believe many of the same things relative to the average of the market? They found that Gen Z was only slightly more on group cohesion than the other groups. In fact, many of the other demographics had stronger group cohesion. But what I found really interesting is measuring that against other types of groups that you might think about addressing as a market. People who floss actually had higher group cohesion. Crossword fans had higher group cohesion. And my favorite one, daily nut eaters, which I wouldn't have thought of as a category that you would want to measure, but apparently that group also has higher group cohesion. And their biggest observation is that too often when we talk about Gen Z, we talk about it in monolithic terms. What is Gen Z going to think about this? How are they going to feel about our brand? Rather than recognize the full spectrum of diversity that's within one demographic group. And if you think about it, it crosses everybody, as they described, from Prince George to Lil Pump. How are you going to find one common breadth of experiences, attitudes, and usages across one group like this? Their big observation is to go deeper and to think a little about it in a slightly different way. Or as Professor Mark Ritson put it, only crap marketers mistake stereotypes for segments. So when we talk about Gen Z, I think it's important to talk about what we're talking about. How are we thinking about Gen Z, and what does it really mean for our brand? That it's not about thinking as one monolithic group and how we're approaching them. The Pew Research Center, which pioneered much of what we think about in terms of generational marketing, has recently started to backtrack from even using the term Gen Z. They feel that it's often misapplied because how we talk about it implies there's much less diversity than there truly is. And their big insight is that the question isn't whether young adults today are different from middle-aged or older adults today. The question is whether young adults today are different from young adults at some specific point in the past. And what they found is that there's much more similarity than difference in how to approach the youth. The big insight, and the one I'd like to think about as we approach Gen Z, is that young adults are often at the leading edge of changing attitudes on emerging social trends. And that's one of the most valuable places that they are useful, helping us see emerging social trends. I want to tell a story about one of my favorite brand examples that's really tapping into how you make a brand relevant for a younger generation. So Duolingo, the language app. This is Zaraya Parvez. A few years ago, she was a 23-year-old social media manager for the company, a recent university grad. And she was brought into the team and felt like she wasn't sure how to really share what she was really feeling about the brand. She felt like sometimes she held back and didn't really bring her true voice forward. And the history of the brand had been kind of interesting. They had grown as a language app. They had, over time, evolved a little bit of a brand persona in this owl that would sort of pop up in your notifications, tell you that it was time to practice your next lesson. And over time, it got a little bit more personality. And over time, it got a little bit even more persistent. And some would say passive-aggressive. These reminders don't seem to be working. We'll stop sending them for now. In some cases, the owl's crying if you don't show up in time to take your next lesson. And this became something that people were paying attention to and sometimes making fun of. It would turn into memes of what it would be like being constantly pestered by this owl to remember to take your language class. Memes were circulating when there was a false emergency alert about a missile. People would mock it up and make it look like the Duolingo owl had actually sent this missile because you had forgotten to study for it. So this was happening out there in the wild. And over time, it got a little bit of a personality, and occasionally Duolingo would do something about it. Now, Zaraya arrived at this brand, and she arrived at an interesting time where they had started to experiment with TikTok, but nothing was resonating. They were taking things from other channels, trying it there, nothing was really happening. And one day, she noticed this giant stuffed owl in the HR part of the office. They would use it for recruiting marketing. And she thought, this owl is too much fun not to do something with it. So she convinced one of her colleagues to put on the owl costume, and within 5 minutes, naturally, the owl was twerking in the corner. She took a video of it, she was sharing with her friends, it was pretty funny, and she went to her boss and said, we're not doing anything with TikTok anyway. Do you mind if I just start experimenting putting things on TikTok? I'm seeing a lot of activity happening, and it's pretty lame what we're putting up there right now. And suddenly, that turned into twerking videos, which turned into videos of the owl stalking people in the office, glaring at you if you use Google Translate instead of Duolingo as a language app. And that started to get traction, so much so that within literally a few weeks, they had a few million followers on TikTok, and it was a lot of fun. By that time, the bigger companies started to pay attention to it, so she decided to bring them into it. Even the legal department. You can imagine brands not feeling safe about your brand icon twerking, and she invited the entire legal team into a video that basically threw a big black carpet over top of the owl to get it to stop. And then a few days later, there was a video of the owl breaking free again. They just kept playing with it and playing with it and playing with it, to the point that now there are over 7 million followers on TikTok, and it's pivoted the entire brand course of the company. They're much more what they describe as social first in their marketing, playing with this whole idea and this tension of doing things you don't think you might even be allowed to do. And this is all possible because of a 23-year-old social media manager who approached branding with fresh eyes, who thought about things a little bit differently. The owl professed undying love for Dua Lipa. That became a big thing for a while. It led to a whole April 1st stunt that they were going to do a reality show where people would basically profess their love to each other, but this threatening owl was in the background. And now even when you buy merchandise in the company, it plays up that whole idea. I hope you enjoy your purchase from my merch store. I also hope that you do your daily lessons, because if you don't, well, let's just say I know where you live now. So over time, the entire brand identity of the company was shaped and formed by this. And this is when I go back to the idea of Gen Z being a vision for the future. She saw things that other people in the company weren't able to see, and ultimately brought that back. Most seasoned people would be thinking about how legal reviews would work, how other teams might perceive the content, but thanks to my naivete, it allowed me to take risks I didn't even know were risks at the time. And that's lesson number one, is how do you listen to the youngest voices in your organizations to help you think about where to go, help you think about how to shape how your brand evolves over time. And it's related to my second point, which is the idea that Don Draper is no longer in charge. I love the show Mad Men. It's really fun for me to imagine marketing in those days. And there's some fundamental parts of the mindset that still operate today. Despite all the tools and technology and ways that we think about marketing, the Don Draper mindset is still showing up. Back in Don Draper's world, there are only a few ways to get your marketing message out there. And it could operate by some sort of command and control style. Your ad ignored here. Nowadays, that no longer works. You can't just tell people what to think about your brands. There's no captive audience anywhere. This brand is so perfect, I can't wait to buy them cheaper online somewhere. What's your Wi-Fi password? Not even a captive audience where they're actually in your store. We learn to speak your language, so your generation will start to pay attention to our ads. And then it responds with a middle finger emoji. This mindset doesn't work any longer. Nowadays, marketing looks much more like this. Every one of these nodes and touch points are places where people discover your brand and your marketing. And we have to evolve our mindset to operate in that world. And there's friction often whenever brands try to make that shift from Don Draper being in charge to an audience of consumers being in charge. So here's a brand that a lot of people love, Nutella. This person obviously loves Nutella a lot. A few years ago, a Nutella superfan, on her own, started a holiday about Nutella, World Nutella Day. She asked people to send in photos and recipes with Nutella of things you can do with Nutella. Now, the Nutella parent company found out about this, and they sent her a cease and desist letter. Not using the brand with the right permission, not the right font, not the right brand voice. And it reflects the knee-jerk reaction that still a lot of brands have when things happen out there that's outside of their direct control. And this is a major shift for brands to get used to. How do you operate in that world? I support word-of-mouth marketing just as long as we tightly control exactly what they say. So how do you operate in that world? It's tricky. And eventually they backtracked. They've actually brought her online. They are now making a big thing out of that. But it was such a missed opportunity and such a reflection of what can naturally happen. Soraya Pervez at Duolingo was ultimately given an Advertiser of the Year award, and her insight that there's something about not really understanding advertising that leads to making great advertising. And I think that's a bit of the approach of how we need to shift it from the Don Drapers of the world to the Soraya Pervezes of the world. How do we approach advertising in a different way? I find it interesting when unexpected things show up for big brands. So Grimace is a character that goes back a long time for McDonald's. McDonald's decided to make a big thing out of it. Grimace's birthday they wanted to celebrate, so they created a Grimace shake, a bright purple shake. And they had some conversations around it. They started hyping it up and talking about it. Out of the blue, someone on TikTok records a video of him buying a shake, talking about how excited he was to share in Grimace's birthday, and then the video pauses and then flashes back to a crime scene with this shake. It's kind of construed as if Grimace was somehow involved. Now you can imagine as a brand owner how you would respond to that. And it started to build. Lots of other people were posting videos. They would go out and buy the Grimace shake, and then suddenly bad things would happen over time. Now if you're a brand owner or in the legal department, these are not the images you want circulating of your brand. But ultimately, what do you do when this is naturally happening and it's showing up in the wild? And McDonald's decided to embrace it a little bit. Not necessarily participate in, but show that they were looking at this trend happening, they're acknowledging it, and ultimately, it takes a huge leap of faith to get that to happen. Their marketing director had this lovely quote that, was there a doubt? Immense doubt. Did we still move forward and get full support up to our top leadership? Sure did. And that's the shift from the Don Draper world to a world where you can allow your brand to operate outside of your direct control and to watch it happen and think about how you could even tap into it. It's an update to our social media policy. This is a hard thing for a lot of brands to get. And if you can operate in this way, it can give you a bit of an edge versus your competition to connect with an audience that's going to be talking about your brand in ways you may not like, and how do you be a part of that conversation over time? If you think we've planted the Grimace shake trend, thank you so much, but you think way too highly of us. This was a level of genius creativity and fun that I could never dream about or plan for. It was all from the fans and the fans only. So being in a place of listening, seeing what's happening out there, and then thinking about how you can tap into it is a big part of what's required for marketers today. Ultimately, this shift from who really owns your brand, and it's a fundamental one that a lot of brands are struggling with. There are a lot of smaller examples out there, too, that I love. Somebody put us on social media a drawing that her child did, imagining an ad for Wendy's. And Wendy's heard this, and they decided to actually make the ad as art directed by this child. Frame by frame, complete with all the misspellings about ketchup and lettuce and things, they made an ad directly inspired by this child posted by the mother. And I think this is a great example of listening to your audience and making it in a way that shows it's participatory, and then you're ultimately shifting the degree of who's ultimately in charge of your brand. And at the end, they gave him full credit. I think that's a great example on a small scale of what this mindset can look like in practice. Okay, third idea I want to share with you is that TikTok is not a strategy. And oftentimes the way we talk about and think about how you use some of the new tools and technologies and platforms, or if that platform is a strategy in and of itself, rather than needing to have a strategy on how to take the most out of a platform like TikTok or whatever it is. Remember to tell our brand story and hit all our key messages and convey our brand purpose and have a clear call to action. And this TikTok campaign also has to go viral. On the count of 3, start dancing. I may have a big YouTube following, but are you sure I'm a good fit to promote your insurance brand? I'm only 12. Just do something millennial. Tell us again how Snapchat will help our brand sell more term life insurance? No one has wanted to engage with our brand on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, Snapchat, or TikTok. But let's see how much they love us on Clubhouse. And all of these things, the platforms are not the problem. It's how the brand is showing up on the platforms that is the problem. So we have to think about what the strategy looks like. And this is something where we have a long ways to go as marketers. There's a piece of research that came out earlier this year that said that 78% of marketers believe that their creative briefs provide clear strategic direction. Only 5% of agencies agree. Little bit of room for improvement there. And ultimately, if we show up with the right strategy, it can help us think about how to most take advantage of wherever it is. I'm sure consumers will show up any minute now to the metaverse. We need to stay focused on our marketing priorities and not get distracted by every shiny new, look, squirrel. And so I love examples where brands are thinking really strategically, not just to do something to show up in a platform, but how does it ultimately reflect a deep consumer insight and the way consumers are currently thinking. So Sweethearts is a brand that's been around for a long time in the US. Is it known here in India? I'm not even sure if it's really. So it's basically over a 100-year-old brand, little candy hearts that have little messages on them that reflect some sort of romantic message that you can give to somebody. So it has this sort of an insight. It's fairly dated, as you can imagine. Over the time, they've tried to update it. Fax Me was a big new product innovation of theirs. Text Me, Be My Bae, that type of thing. Occasionally, they have contests to pick the next message. Kind of lame and didn't really resonate. A couple of years ago, they decided to look into a little bit of research. And they noticed that on Tinder, people were talking about their relationship status as situationships. In fact, mentions of situationships increased in Tinder bios by 49%. It's a reflection about the current generation thinking about relationships in a different way. And they decided that they would play around with that. They launched a limited edition SKU, Sweethearts Situationships, and there were all the misprints where you couldn't quite see what the messaging had to say. We packaged only our blurriest, vaguest, most indecipherable candies to be perfect for your undefined relationships. Do you know how much you mean to me? Because I don't, and then kind of can't really see what it has to say on it. And what I love about the genius of this campaign is they took their misprints. These are the ones they were probably going to have to throw away. And instead, they took this asset, turned it into a limited edition SKU, and made a big social media push with it, and got people suddenly thinking about a 120-year-old brand in a way that reflects modern insights about modern relationships. And I think that type of work is available to any brand. Relationship status: single, married, in a relationship, X. Usually avoiding Valentine's Day at all costs, but now Sweethearts makes situationship candies, and I feel seen. So I think, again, this type of thing is available to any brand. Okay, fourth idea I want to share with you is the idea that continuity is more important than virality. For so long, brands have been chasing the idea of somehow going viral, and it causes them to often miss the boat about what's possible. What we need to boost sales is a viral video. On the count of 3, do something funny. And ultimately, when they jump into social media networks, it can feel very forced because of that. There's a new social media network. Cool. What you doing as the brand shows up? We just want to be real with you. Hey, where'd they go? And then they're all gone. And it's often because the way brands show up can feel a bit like this. There's a conversation happening. I have new baby pics to share. I just got back from my reunion. And then a brand message. Did you know that we have 7 subs under 6 grams of fat? And often the listening part of the equation doesn't even show up, and brands can miss the boat. One way that I've been thinking about this lately comes from Sarah Wilson, who's a former Facebook executive. And she's been describing some of the shift in social media as moving toward what she's describing as digital campfires. Rather than environments where people are trying to set up to reach everybody, oftentimes audiences are congregating in smaller groups. How do you show up to these digital campfires in ways that are additive to the group? The entire premise of a digital campfire is to veer away from sharing digital posts with your entire friends list, but instead build smaller communities with like-minded people to connect with. And this is an opportunity for brands to really rethink about it. Think about it in completely unexpected ways. One of my favorite examples over the last couple years is Emily Weiss, who started a cosmetics brand called Glossier. One of their most successful digital campfires was actually a Slack channel. Not what you think about for cosmetics. But they invited 1,000 of their top consumers and said, we'd love to collaborate with you on new products. They built this dedicated Slack channel. It got a tremendous amount of engagement within this group and ultimately led to one of their biggest new product innovations over the last few years. And I think that type of opportunity is available for us too. Think about where our consumers are, and then think about how we can add value to those consumers. Careful, the last content was full of marketing. How do we work with fake influencers, with fake followers and fake engagement in a more authentic way? And the opportunity for brands to really think about what that continuity looks like for them. Sweet Greens, which has been really effective with this, with their salad restaurant, in terms of inviting people to be a part of a limited edition overtime that people can tap into and want to see what the next installment is. Who are they going to partner with next? How are they going to reinvent the salad based on new and different people? Sometimes often going very kind of in niche directions, as with this restaurant in South Florida, a salad only available there to spotlight a restaurant in a regional area. I think that opportunity is available for us too. This quote from Zariah Parveta I really like, that you can't plan virality, but you can plan mentality. And I think that's a big shift on how we approach brands. One of my favorite discoveries on my last trip to India was Amul dairy, and obviously as a cartoonist, I love that the cartoons change over time, and as I look at it, it's actually one of the longest running advertising campaigns I can think of anywhere in the world, based on a new insight changing over time, tapping into key themes that are happening in people's lives right away. And I was sad to learn before this trip that the creator of that campaign just passed away last year. But what I find interesting is a piece of research, or a quote rather, from somebody in Mumbai who was interviewing people and said he asked what their favorite brand was, and the answer 9 times out of 10 was Amul. They're in their early 20s. He thought they would have talked about Apple or Nike, and instead they're talking about an old dairy brand. And I think that shows the potential for all of us to think about the right mentality to tap into this audience, that you don't need to alienate your current audience to engage with the younger audience. And that's something that we can all tap into. And the fifth and final thing I want to share with you is the idea about not taking ourselves too seriously. Oftentimes, whenever I hear about Gen Z, it's in the context of, we don't want to misspeak or we're going to get in trouble. And as a result, there's this myth, I think, operating in the world of marketing that it's better to be too serious than sorry. And it's a missed opportunity. Right after COVID started happening, I drew this cartoon about how every brand sounded. Some brand we apparently gave an email address to 3 or 4 years ago wants to know they're here for us in this difficult time. And as a result, in this difficult time, every brand looked like that. And what a missed opportunity. Who wants to see that over and over and over again? As somebody from Kantar observed, people don't want ad breaks filled with reminders that life is tough. And this was part of a piece of research showing how brands were using humor less and less frequently over time, despite the fact that brands that would find successful ways to use humor were ultimately really successful and could provide a way for them to break through. The myth, too, along these lines is that there's one-size-fits-all brand of humor. And I'm here to tell you that every brand and every individual has their own unique type of humor, and many types of humor are fully appropriate for brands to use, and particularly to use in ways that are appealing to the youngest generation. Sometimes brands operate on a copycat mentality. Amy Brown at Wendy's is credited with being the first brand to pioneer sort of the snarky approach with Twitter a few years ago, where McDonald's would post something and Wendy's would quickly follow with a snarky observation going right at them. And again, McDonald's would misapply a quote, forgetting to put the copy in the link, and Wendy's would come back and mock them for their milkshake machines not working. But every other brand started to see that happen and said, oh, we're just going to do the same thing. We're just going to be snarky online. And that's not the way ultimately you connect with a generation. Ultimately, you find what your own brand stands for and find a way to do that authentically to your own brand. Amy's own comment on this is that there are authentic ways to still be weird on the internet. It's time to put the Wendy's thing to bed. So as you think about not taking yourself too seriously, find what's true for your audience. One thing I find useful is to think about humor in 4 buckets. There's self-enhancing humor, where you laugh at yourself. There's affiliative humor, where you laugh with others. There's self-defeating humor, where you put yourself down. And then there's aggressive humor, where you put others down. And it's a bit on a spectrum of high empathy, low empathy, on yourself or for others. My big message for you is that humor can be an act of empathy. If you start there, that'll alleviate 99% of the concerns you can imagine. And I'll share just 2 quick examples and then close out. On the self-enhancing humor, this was a small brand in London, and at the start of COVID, they had purchased their first ever outdoor ad campaign, only to find it would run when nobody was outside. So they decided to kind of mock the situation a little bit. Our first ever poster, seen by a runner and 1 pigeon, typical. Do an ad when it's warmer, they said. More people will see it, they said. As a result of their sense of humor, people did see the campaign because they were allowed to be irreverent and allowed to take things forward. Maybe we should have made a TV ad instead. And then from the affiliative standpoint, this is one of my favorite recent examples, a toilet paper brand called Who Gives a Crap. They decided to tap into the insight that there could be something funny to do with the fact that their toilet paper is recycled from paper. And so they have a whole campaign called Flush Your Ex, where you can take love letters from somebody you've broken up with, send it to their brand, and they'll recycle it as toilet paper that they then send out into the world. And it's a great example of having a sense of humor, tapping into an insight, and ultimately connecting in a way that's relevant to an audience. And that brings me to where I want to finish, which is tapping into Gen Z is incredibly exciting, but it's ultimately nothing completely new. Brands have to reinvent themselves all the time. This year, we're disrupting how we do marketing. Didn't we do that last year? No, last year we transformed marketing. Oh, that was 2 years ago. Oh, right, we're reinventing marketing. It's about time. And over the decades, things can change, but ultimately there's some truisms, and one of those is that we will always be chasing the younger generation. Why are we so obsessed with Gen Z? They're not our main customer. Their buying power is lower. Is it just because it's trendy? Relax, Gen Z is no longer our focus. Phew. We're shifting to Gen Alpha. And with that, I want to leave you and say thank you so much for having me here. It's such a great to be here.